Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The U.S. is stepping up as a global mediator, juggling high-stakes diplomacy on two major fronts. Over on the weekend, American officials held back-to-back ceasefire talks in Saudi Arabia, first with Ukraine on March 23rd, then a 12-hour meeting with Russia on the 24th. The discussion led to a joint statement with Moscow, which is expected to be on reviving the Black Sea grain deal and halting attacks on critical infrastructure. The Trump administration is looking to target April 20th, Easter Sunday, as a symbolic deadline for a partial ceasefire. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Israeli forces have pushed deeper into Gaza following the collapse of ceasefire talks with Hamas. Concerns are mounting as Israeli leaders now say full occupation may be necessary to defeat Hamas, marking a significant policy shift. For more on the situation in the Middle East, we invite Robert Lawrence, assistant professor at Dongduk Women's University. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you for coming on. And also joining us is Lee Moon-jung, professor of international studies at Gongju National University. Great to have you, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start right away with Professor Lawrence first. So on March 23rd, the U.S. and Ukraine held talks in Riyadh ahead of the scheduled trilateral ceasefire discussions. Then on the 24th, the U.S. met separately with the Russian delegation. How significant are these back-to-back meetings in shaping the partial ceasefire plan?
Yeah, so the significance of the meetings, it kind of depends who you ask, to be honest. The American delegation led by Stephen Witkoff was very optimistic in the lead up to the negotiations. There was a bit of a blitz on the American media, and he spoke very optimistically about getting outcomes, and then he was he spoke highly of Vladimir Putin and President Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin. When you looked at the Ukrainians, they were less optimistic, and in the press, they were a little bit critical about the U.S. envoy's comments regarding the subject and what they thought was kind of mimicking Russia's talking points. The Russians, for their part, they downplayed any big outcome coming from the meetings. They were saying that the meetings are just the beginning of a long and nuanced process. It's going to be difficult. So, these meetings, they could lead to some progress if the U.S. can come up with creative proposals that produce mutually beneficial arrangements, that could be used as a starting point for indirect talks. So these meetings might shape a partial ceasefire, but right now the sides are very far from each other on some very key issues, and the kinetic engagement between the two states is still ongoing in the form of drone and missile strikes. So there's no cause for celebration yet.
Right, it's still early to say, but we'll have to see in the next coming days or months or so. Now, let's also bring in Professor Lim into the conversation. Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov described the talks with Washington as productive and dense, while the U.S. delegation indicated they're aiming to freeze frontline activity and reinitiate grain exports via the Black Sea. How do you assess the latest discussions?
Well, I want to be more cautiously optimistic. Of course, I totally agree with Professor Lawrence's analysis. Again, the U.S. side, Washington shows is more optimism about the progress or the possibility of further progress. However, at the same time, we do see a kind of more chilled, skeptical voice from Moscow. I think that reveals, again, there is a kind of fundamental gap between the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. Of course, the U.S.'s role is trying to get the gap between the two narrowed down. However, it is not that easy. Of course, there are many reasons for this war. However, fundamentally speaking, if I just quote Professor John Mearsheimer's like a very realistic view in the international relations field, again, he has actually criticized, Dr. Mearsheimer has criticized this Western side, which is led or represented by the U.S. Again, NATO's expansion has again given a good reason or threat again to Russia. Again, so from Russian Russians' point of view, as long as that kind of threat is removed again from Ukraine, they can't probably accept, the end of the war. So the temporary ceasefire, for example, ceasefire over the energy-related infrastructure can be discussed, or a discussion for the restart of the Black Sea, those crop-related agreements can be also discussed as well. But that does not necessarily guarantee this war can be ended very soon. So that is why the rest of the world is very much worried about, and at the same time want to remain optimistic about the progress between the three different parties.
Right. So, well, nothing's finalized yet. It does sound like both sides are trying to lock in some early wins. Now to Washington's talks with Moscow, Professor Lim. The two sides held a very lengthy 12-hour meeting in Saudi. They also agreed on a joint statement, we hear. We hear also that the resumption of the Black Sea Agreement was also top of the agenda. What could the joint statement that they agreed upon entail? And could you also explain for us what's Moscow's stance?
Well, we will see the joint statement very soon. But as I already pointed out, Russia has a very fundamental concerns about its own security. Of course, that's the vice versa situation. So from Ukrainians' point of view, ceasefire cannot guarantee the permanent peace between the two, or it cannot even guarantee the national security of Ukraine. So that is why they also very much obsessed with the collective defense-like mechanism with the other like-minded countries of Europe. Again, so that is why as I mentioned, we do see a kind of very deep gap again between the Russia and Ukrainian side. Again, it is difficult to narrow down those gaps, but more pragmatically speaking, again, Ukraine and Russia, both, Russia, of course, is the largest country in the world, but Ukraine, too, it is the largest country in Europe, except, again, Russia. And both countries have been exporters of the energy and at the same time grains, crops, again, the food for many other countries. For example, like African countries or Middle East. So without supplying enough, again, the food, the grain crops for those regions, again, all this humanitarian crisis can be further accelerated. So definitely in order to avoid any of those further humanitarian crises in other regions, that kind of, again, the restart of the Black Sea agreements, or halt of the attacks over energy infrastructure, those kind of, again, the pragmatic approaches also needed to be done. So I presume, or I guess, through the joint statement, we might see those kind of, again, more pragmatic approaches, or kind of, agreements over those kind of practical issues. But again, I'm a little bit pessimistic about how far they can go further, again, to end actually the war.
Well, that was really helpful context, Professor Lim. Understanding Russia's position will be key as we track how this joint statement actually plays out. Now, unlike a three-party negotiation, the U.S. is conducting shuttle diplomacy, meeting Russia and Ukraine separately. Professor Lawrence, what are the strategic reasons behind this structure, and what does it suggest about the level of trust or lack of between Moscow and Kyiv?
Right. So initially, the representatives from separate countries are having meetings at separate times. So the Americans met the Ukrainians on one day, then met the Russians, and then they're planning on meeting the Ukrainians again today in Saudi Arabia. The idea, in theory, is to reach a threshold of agreement where indirect talks are possible. By indirect talks, this time we're talking about having simultaneous meetings. So the Russians in one room, the Ukrainians in another room, and then the U.S. representatives shuttling back and forth between the rooms, trying to narrow that gap, as Professor Lim was talking about before. Regarding trust, or the lack thereof, there's a dismal trust situation between the two countries. Both sides are accusing each other of breaking the energy and key infrastructure ceasefire that was tentatively agreed upon last week via phone. Ukrainians in general, I think, don't trust Putin's ambitions in Ukraine. And they see no indication that Putin has any ambition to actually get a peace deal secured. Russia, for its part, it doesn't trust Ukrainians' ambitions regarding a realignment towards the West. So even when we're talking about agendas going into this meeting, I think there's a lot of big differences. There are a lot of big differences. So Russia wants to dictate the terms of any agreement, and they want their demands met before they move forward. They're also happy to draw out negotiations because right now I think they see themselves on the front foot. Ukraine, on the other hand, they want the Americans to put more pressure on Russia so that if and when there are indirect talks, they're going to be in a better position. And they also, of course, want quick results while they still have the Kursk region as leverage. So, disagreement and distrust are in abundance in these talks in Saudi Arabia right now.
Right, that's a crucial point since, this separate track diplomacy really does highlight how fragile trust remains between Kyiv and Moscow. Now, as for the outcome of the talks, there are reports that the Trump administration has set April 20th, Eastern, both Catholic and Russian Orthodox calendars, as a symbolic target for a ceasefire deal. Is this timeline realistic, Professor Lawrence?
Well, I think peace by Easter sounds nice to a lot of ears, but to be perfectly honest, I think 3.5 weeks is pretty ambitious. All indications out of the Kremlin are that Moscow is prioritizing bilateral relations with the United States regarding NATO expansion and sanctions relief. They were prioritizing this over a peace deal with Ukraine right now. So if Moscow isn't pressured into making real commitments, towards some sort of a deal, I think they'll probably gladly delay by adding demands and leveraging the U.S. desire for a speedy conclusion to maximize concessions in their negotiations. That may lead for a more space for some sort of a grand bargain. But given Putin's general global perspective, the way he positions himself globally, I think that's unlikely. For years now, he's been unhappy, with the world order that came about after the fall of the Soviet Union, U.S. hegemony and unipolarity. I think we're no longer in that moment, but he would like to speed that along into a multipolar world. He's openly spoken about preferring a multipolar world in which great powers have their spheres of influence. He's enjoyed being, kind of antagonistic towards most U.S. foreign policy for the past 10 years too. So I think, given his global objectives, it's not likely. One, I don't think it's possible to get the negotiations finished in 3.5 weeks. Two, I don't think Putin has any plan to give Donald Trump an easy win like that. Who knows? We'll cross our fingers. Hopefully we can always have optimism and hope that something like that could happen. But 3.5 weeks is a pretty short time.
Right. So it's a very ambitious goal as of this situation. Professor Lim, given that the previous full ceasefire attempt has failed, the current 30-day partial ceasefire actually focuses on halting attacks on energy and infrastructure sector. Do you think this narrow scope still builds momentum towards lasting peace?
Well, first of all, this vocabulary, energy, spaces, infrastructure, can be interpreted pretty differently by different players. Again, from Ukraine's point of view, definitely they want to broaden the scope of energy, space, again, the infrastructure. Whereas, Russia is more focusing on just energy hyper-related infrastructure. Again, from Ukraine's point of view, they also definitely, want to avoid any further humanitarian crisis. For example, if there is an attack over their transportation or hospital, like a public health facility, if so, their, Ukrainian citizens, their daily lives will be damaged enemies further. So again, what I'm trying to say is there is a kind of perception gap or understanding gap, interpretation gap between the two different parties. But having said that, as Professor Lauren just briefly mentioned, again, on 21, the Friday last week, again, there was an attack over the gas meter, the facility in the Kursk state, and both sides again they are blaming the other, from Russia's point of view. I mean, this is done by the Ukrainian. And Ukrainian said this is more like a kind of self-suiciding attack to just, criticize the Ukraine. So we don't know real truths here. But what I'm trying to say is, again, through seeing these kind of, again, the attacks over the energy infrastructure, we still do see a very dark reality, again, between the two parties. Again, even though they are talking about, again, the ceasefire over the energy infrastructure. However, at the same time, they are attacking one another. This is a pretty much reminiscent, for me, again, of the Korean War situations. When we were discussing on armistice, again, the battle on the ground got just more severe and severe because, both sides wanted to at least, one more meter or one more step, again, to the other side before the ceasefire or before the armistice is completed. So even though I feel very sad and bad about the situations, but cautiously I will say these kind of, again, the interactions, viral exchange of violence can continue for a while, again, before we see a clear kind of agreement between the two.
Right. We're seeing more of those battles going on. Now, let's also turn briefly to the situation in the Middle East, Professor Lim, with the Israel-Hamas ceasefire talks collapsing. The Israeli military has now deployed troops into both northern and also southern Gaza. Are we now seeing a start of a full-scale ground invasion?
Well, it's another very unfortunate situation. I think we definitely need to go back to the original point. Of course, I'm not negating those deep historical conflicts between the Israel and Hamas and the Palestine people, but this specific war started with October 7th, that attack. So definitely we need to go back to the hostage, that issue. We definitely, want to see that all these, victims can come back to home safely. That will be, I think, the starting point. Of course, the 3 stages were designed. However, at the first step, we do see all these, situations. I'm not trying to advocate one specific side, but I'm trying to say, again, that we need to, again, go back to the original point of the conflict. Again, which is very unfortunate situations, because we now see for example, U.S. attacks over the Houthi in the Red Sea, of course, which is kind of understandable because, of course, if you think about all this maritime transportation, now many of those, not only just U.S. commercial ships, but also other countries' commercial ships cannot just safely, move from the Suez Canal to the Red Sea and then to the those Indian Ocean. So definitely, we need to improve the situation. So now we see this attack, which is also related to the concern over the Iran versus Israel situation. So all these, conflicts are intertwined. So that is why I want to still, keep emphasizing, we need to go back to the original point. Otherwise, it is really difficult to untie all this, very much complicating, again, the situations in Middle East.
Mm-hmm. And amid this, Israeli leadership, including Prime Minister Netanyahu and his top security aides, reportedly believe that fully occupying parts of Gaza is the only way to defeat Hamas. Professor Lawrence, how significant is this shift from Israel's previous stance of weakening Hamas through pressure and installing a new governing body?
Well, it's it is a significant development if that is indeed the plan, but it's not a new idea, and there might be several motivations that are kind of prompting this. So military officials have argued since just after October 7th that this was the only way forward. A lot of people thought there was no way to finish the government and military of Hamas without a full invasion. So it's not a new concept. But this also might just be a negotiation tactic. It might be meant to compel Hamas into releasing more hostages or the rest of the hostages, or for neighboring Arab states to get more involved in the process. But there's also a domestic dimension here that's very important. So if Benjamin Netanyahu's government can't pass the budget by the end of the month, so we're looking at about 6 days now, then the Knesset will be dissolved and they have to have new elections. Looking at the polling data right now, that does not look good for Benjamin Netanyahu if he couldn't do it. So, by appeasing the far right and re-engaging militarily with Gaza and some other domestic maneuvering that he's done with some firing, he's basically brought back in the far right into his coalition, especially Itamar Ben-Gvir has rejoined the coalition, and he's been reinstated as the Minister of National Security. So now he will almost certainly be able to pass the 2025 budget, and that'll ensure his hold on power for now. That's a little bit cynical, but there are a lot of people and a lot of analysts and people in Israel who read the situation that way. So I'm not saying it's one or the other. I think it's probably a combination of those three, but certainly there are a lot of dynamics involved. If we're going to take this literally, then there are also going to be a lot of domestic obstacles. One, it's going to be a tough sell for the reservist. They're already going through response rate problems, and there's a worry about burnout. Additionally, polling data suggests that the public is not going to be on board with this, and any prolonged stay in Gaza is going to result in casualties for the IDF and possibly the remaining hostages. So I'm not sure how practical this is or how long it's going to be sustained.
Right, so it seems the situation is getting worse, and more efforts must really be done to end the war, both in Ukraine and Israel as well. We'll have to see how Washington navigates the peace efforts, but as of now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Professor Lawrence and Professor Lim, thank you so much for your presence tonight. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having us.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.